The chainsaw roared to life just feet from my property line. I rushed outside to find 3 workers cutting down the maple trees I had planted 5 years ago. Behind them stood Corinne, arms crossed, a smirk playing across her face as she watched my approaching fury. "These trees are on my property now," she announced loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. I clutched the property deed in my trembling hands, the official boundaries highlighted in yellow. "This is my land." "You have no right," I shouted over the mechanical growl. Corinne simply waved a piece of paper. "The HOA voted. The township approved. This land belongs to me now." The worker nearest to me glanced uncomfortably between us before revving the chainsaw again. I watched helplessly as the first maple crashed to the ground, feeling as though something inside me fell with it. That moment, standing in the yard I had lovingly tended for years, I realized the system was rigged against me. But systems can be played both ways. And Corinne had no idea what I was about to discover about her precious house. 3 years ago, I purchased my dream property in the Oak Ridge neighborhood, a semi-rural community with spacious lots and just enough distance between houses to feel private without being isolated. The house itself was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with good bones but outdated finishes. What sold me was the land. Nearly an acre of possibility stretched behind the house, with mature trees dotting the perimeter and open space perfect for the extensive garden I had always dreamed of cultivating. Before signing any paperwork, I did my due diligence. I studied the property survey, confirmed the boundaries with the township office, and researched any easements or restrictions that might limit my plans. Everything checked out perfectly. The property lines were clearly marked with metal stakes driven deep into the ground at each corner, and I even took photographs standing beside each marker for my records. I am not a person who leaves things to chance, especially not with the largest investment of my life. My neighbors initially seemed wonderful. To the east lived the Thompsons, an elderly couple who had been in the neighborhood since it was built in the 1970s. They welcomed me with homemade bread and stories about the area. To the west was a vacant lot that belonged to the developer, still waiting for the right buyer. Behind my property was protected woodland that could never be developed, which guaranteed my privacy and peaceful views would remain undisturbed. I spent those first 3 years gradually making the house and land my own. I renovated the kitchen, installed new energy-efficient windows, and planted those maple saplings along the western edge of my property. I established a vegetable garden that produced enough tomatoes and zucchini to share with the entire street each summer. On weekends, neighbors would stop by while walking their dogs, complimenting my landscaping efforts or accepting bags of fresh produce. Life felt settled and secure. Everything changed when the vacant lot beside me finally sold. Construction crews arrived in early spring, and within months, a sprawling 2-story colonial house stood where empty land had been. It dwarfed my modest ranch and seemed intentionally designed to loom over my property. The new owner arrived on a Sunday afternoon, directing movers with military precision as they unloaded furniture from 2 large trucks. Her name was Corinne Westfield. She introduced herself by bringing over a store-bought cake and asking detailed questions about the neighborhood. She seemed pleasant enough at first, polished, articulate, and clearly affluent. She mentioned being on multiple civic committees in her previous town and knowing several local officials here already. I gave her the standard neighborly welcome, pointing out the best local restaurants and warning her about the occasional power outages during storms. Over the next few weeks, our interactions remained cordial but increasingly focused on one topic: my land. Corinne would stand at the edge of her property, coffee cup in hand, studying my backyard with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You have so much unused space back there," she commented one morning. "Do you have plans for all of it?" Her tone suggested she found my undeveloped land somehow wasteful. I explained my 5-year landscaping plan, including the eventual addition of a greenhouse and pond. She nodded politely but seemed unconvinced. Property is such an investment these days. Every square foot should be maximized, she said before asking casually, have you ever had the boundaries professionally surveyed? Those old markers can be so unreliable. I should have recognized the warning signs in that simple question. Instead, I assured her that yes, the boundaries were accurately marked and officially recorded. Karen smiled and changed the subject, but something in her expression stayed with me. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision. I simply did not know yet what that decision would cost me. The first real sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I noticed Karen walking along what I knew to be my western property line, taking measurements and making notes on a clipboard. When she saw me watching from my kitchen window, she waved cheerfully as if nothing was unusual about surveying land that did not belong to her. Confused but not yet alarmed, I decided to speak with her directly. "Good morning, Karen," I called as I approached. "What are you working on there?" I kept my tone friendly, giving her the benefit of the doubt. Karen turned with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Just planning my landscaping project. I am thinking of extending my garden area to make better use of this space." "This space is actually part of my property," I explained gently. "The boundary line is about 8 feet that way, where those metal stakes are driven into the ground." I pointed to the survey markers that had been in place since before I purchased the home. Karen tilted her head, her expression a practiced blend of confusion and concern. "Oh, I think there might be some misunderstanding. According to the development plans I obtained from the township, the property line runs right here." She gestured to a spot nearly 15 feet into my land, which would encompass not only my newly planted maple trees, but also a significant portion of my planned garden expansion. My heart rate quickened, but I maintained my composure. "There must be some mistake in whatever documents you are looking at. I have the official survey from when I purchased the property 3 years ago. I would be happy to show you." "That would be lovely," Karen replied, but her tone suggested she was merely humoring me. "I have documentation as well. Perhaps we can compare notes tomorrow. I have appointments all day today." I agreed, though uneasiness had settled in my stomach. That evening, I retrieved my property documents from the fireproof safe where I kept all important papers. The survey map clearly showed the boundaries exactly where I knew them to be, with precise measurements from the street and neighboring properties. I felt reassured by the official stamp and notarized signature on the document. The next morning, Karen canceled our meeting via text message, citing a busy schedule. 3 days passed with no further discussion. Then, on Saturday morning, I was awakened by the sound of voices and metal striking stone. I looked out my bedroom window to see 2 men in work uniforms removing my survey markers. Karen stood nearby, directing them. I rushed outside, not bothering to change out of my pajamas. "Excuse me, what is happening here?" My voice came out higher and more panicked than I intended. One worker looked up, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am asked us to reset the property markers according to new survey coordinates," he explained, nodding toward Karen. Karen approached, holding a document with what appeared to be an official seal. "Good morning. I hope we did not wake you. I received the updated survey information from the township yesterday. It confirms what I suspected. There was an error in the original development plans that has been propagating through property records for years." She handed me the document, which indeed showed property lines redrawn exactly where she had indicated days earlier. It looked authentic, with stamps and signatures, but something felt deeply wrong. "This cannot be correct," I insisted. I need to contact my attorney and the original surveyor. Of course, Corinne replied smoothly. But in the meantime, I have scheduled landscapers to begin work on Monday. The township has already approved my plans based on these official boundaries. Before I could respond, she walked away, leaving me standing in my yard holding a document that threatened to steal a significant portion of my property. The workers, sensing the tension, packed up their equipment and left quickly, but the damage was done. My survey markers had been moved, and new ones placed according to Corinne's document. That afternoon, I called the township office only to discover they were closed until Monday. I then contacted my real estate attorney, leaving an urgent message explaining the situation. The weekend stretched endlessly as I paced my house, reviewing my documents and growing increasingly certain that something underhanded was occurring. Monday morning brought the promised landscapers, who began work before I could even contact the township. I approached them, explaining the property dispute, but they simply referred me to Corinne. "We just go by the markers and the work order, ma'am," the foreman explained apologetically. When I finally reached someone at the township office, I was transferred 3 times before speaking with a clerk who could not locate my original survey in their digital system. "There appears to have been a recent update to that plat," she informed me. "I can see a modification was approved last Thursday by the zoning administrator." Without notifying me, the actual property owner, I asked incredulously. "Sometimes notifications get delayed in the system," she offered weakly. "I suggest you come in and file a formal dispute if you believe there is an error." By the time I returned home that afternoon, Corinne's landscapers had already cleared a 6-foot strip of my land, removing small plants and preparing the soil for whatever she planned to install. The neighborhood was taking notice now, with several neighbors slowing their cars or pausing their walks to observe the obvious conflict brewing between properties. Corinne had transformed from new neighbor to property thief in less than a month, and I was only beginning to understand how calculated her actions had been from the very start. First thing Tuesday morning, I scheduled an appointment with Maxwell Roberts, a property attorney recommended by a colleague. His office was located downtown in a renovated Victorian house that had been converted to professional space. The waiting room featured framed maps of the county dating back to the 1800s, appropriate decor for someone who specialized in property disputes. "Based on what you have shown me," Maxwell said after reviewing my documents for nearly an hour, "your original survey is correct and legally binding. The new survey Corinne produced appears to have proper formatting and stamps, but there are inconsistencies with the township records I accessed this morning." He pointed to several measurements that did not align with the county plat maps. "Someone pushed this through without proper verification." Relief washed over me. So what do we do now? First, we send a formal cease and desist letter demanding all work stop immediately and the original boundaries be restored, Maxwell explained. "We include copies of your legitimate documentation. If she fails to comply, we file for an emergency injunction with the county court." The cease and desist letter was delivered by courier that same afternoon. I watched from my home office window as Corinne accepted the envelope, glanced at the return address, and set it aside without opening it. Her landscapers continued working on what was clearly my property, now installing an elaborate stone path that cut through where my vegetable garden expansion was planned. 2 days later, Maxwell informed me that Corinne had not responded to the letter. We proceeded with filing for an injunction, but the earliest court date available was 3 weeks away. Meanwhile, Corinne accelerated her project. What had begun as landscaping now included the foundation for what appeared to be a gazebo or small outbuilding positioned squarely on the disputed land. When I confronted her again, recording our conversation on my phone as Maxwell had advised, Corinne was unfazed. "The work has been approved by all necessary authorities," she stated calmly. "If you continue to harass me about this, I will be forced to file a restraining order." "This is my property," I insisted. "We have filed for an injunction and will be heard in court." Corinne smiled with genuine amusement. "Yes, I received notice of that this morning. I look forward to resolving this misunderstanding. In the meantime, perhaps you should speak with Zoning Administrator Phillips. He might help you understand the situation better." That name triggered a memory. During one of our early conversations, Corinne had mentioned her friendship with several local officials, including someone named Phillips who she played golf with regularly. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Corinne had connections within the local government, connections she was clearly using to manipulate the system. I visited the township offices the next day and requested a meeting with Administrator Phillips. His secretary informed me he was unavailable for 2 weeks due to a conference and subsequent vacation. When I asked to speak with anyone else regarding the property dispute, I was directed to a junior clerk who appeared nervous when I mentioned Corinne's name. "I am not authorized to discuss ongoing zoning matters," he stammered, avoiding eye contact. "All inquiries about that particular case need to go through Administrator Phillips directly." Frustrated but determined, I began documenting everything with methodical precision. I took daily photographs of the encroachment, recorded all conversations, kept detailed notes of every interaction with township officials, and created a timeline of events. Maxwell assured me this documentation would strengthen our case, but watching Corinne's project advance day by day was taking an emotional toll. Then came the most shocking development yet. I received an official notification from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association announcing an emergency meeting to vote on a proposed property line adjustment initiative, affecting several properties in the neighborhood, including mine. The justification cited historical surveying inconsistencies and community aesthetic continuity. "But I never even knew we had an active HOA," I told Maxwell during our follow-up meeting. "When I purchased the house, the agent mentioned there was an HOA on record, but that it had been dormant for years with no collected dues or enforced regulations." Maxwell frowned as he examined the notice. "This appears to be technically legal. The HOA bylaws likely remained on record even if inactive. Someone has revived it using the procedures outlined in the original incorporation documents." He looked up at me gravely. "And I would bet anything that someone is Corinne." Further investigation confirmed Maxwell's suspicion. Corinne had indeed revitalized the dormant HOA 3 weeks after moving in, appointing herself interim president until official elections could be held, elections that had been quietly announced via small notices posted on community bulletin boards when most residents were away during spring break. She planned this from the beginning, I realized aloud. She researched properties with dormant HOAs, found mine, bought the adjacent lot, and set this whole scheme in motion. Maxwell nodded grimly. "And now she is using the revived HOA to create a parallel authority to the township, giving herself another avenue to legitimize the property theft if our injunction succeeds." The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, just 5 days before our court date for the injunction. I spent those days frantically contacting neighbors, explaining the situation, and urging them to attend the meeting to vote against the proposal. Many seemed sympathetic but non-committal. Several mentioned not wanting to get involved in neighborhood drama. As the meeting approached, I felt the walls closing in. Karen had orchestrated a brilliant, multi-layered attack on my property rights, utilizing systems that were supposed to protect homeowners. The battle was no longer just about the land. It had become about exposing manipulation and corruption in local governance. What I did not yet realize was how deep that corruption went, or how devastating the HOA meeting would prove to be for my case. The Oak Ridge Community Center had not been used for an official HOA meeting in over 5 years, according to the Thompsons. As I arrived 30 minutes early, clipboard and documentation in hand, I was shocked to find the parking lot already nearly full. Inside, the meeting room was buzzing with activity, filled with faces I had never seen in our neighborhood. "Who are all these people?" I whispered to Mrs. Thompson, who had arrived just before me. She shook her head in confusion. "I recognize barely half of them. The others must be from the new development across the highway. They are not even part of our HOA district." Before I could process this information, Karen stepped up to the podium, dressed in a tailored suit that projected authority and professionalism. "As interim president, I call this emergency meeting of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association to order," she announced, her voice carrying confidently through the room. I raised my hand immediately. "Point of order. There appear to be numerous attendees who do not reside within Oak Ridge boundaries. Only residents should be permitted to vote on community matters." Karen smiled patiently, as if addressing a confused child. According to HOA Bylaw 17.3, property owners may designate a proxy to represent their interests at meetings if they are unable to attend. Each person here has proper proxy documentation on file. "Filed when, with whom?" I challenged. "The HOA has been inactive for years." The revival process included notification of all homeowners regarding updated procedures, Karen replied smoothly. "All paperwork was properly filed with the HOA secretary 3 weeks ago." The secretary turned out to be Karen's next-door neighbor on the other side, a woman who had moved in just 1 month after Karen and who sat beside her now, nodding in confirmation. The meeting proceeded with ruthless efficiency. When my turn came to present evidence regarding the property line dispute, Karen interrupted after just 2 minutes. "In the interest of time, we need to move forward with the agenda. The full proposal has been available for review at the HOA website for the required 5 days." "What website?" several homeowners murmured in confusion. The vote was called before many had fully understood what was happening. The Property Line Adjustment Initiative passed by a significant margin, with all the mysterious proxy voters raising their hands in unison. The official HOA resolution now supported Karen's version of the boundary lines, citing community standards and aesthetic continuity as justification. As the meeting disbanded, I approached several legitimate neighbors, urging them to contest the proceedings. Most avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with confrontation. One neighbor pulled me aside sympathetically. "Listen, I know something fishy is happening, but Karen's husband is on the township council and her brother-in-law works for the county judge. People are afraid to get on their bad side. I am sorry." He walked away quickly, leaving me standing alone in the emptying room. The next morning, I called Maxwell with the devastating news. "She stacked the meeting with fake proxy voters," I explained. "The HOA approved her version of the property lines." Maxwell was silent for a moment. "This complicates our injunction request," he finally admitted. "The judge will now see conflicting community standards. While HOA decisions do not legally override property deeds, they do carry weight in determining community norms and expectations." He was right. When we appeared before Judge Harrison the following week, the township presented the HOA resolution as evidence of community consensus regarding property boundaries. Administrator Phillips testified that historical surveys contained inconsistencies that the resolution helped rectify. Our injunction was denied pending full review of all documentation, which could take months. The moment I returned home from court, I heard the chainsaw. From my front window, I watched in horror as workers began cutting down my maple trees, the same trees I had carefully nurtured for 5 years. Corinne stood supervising, occasionally glancing toward my house. When she noticed me watching, she gave a small, triumphant wave. I rushed outside, screaming for them to stop. The workers looked uncomfortable but continued under Corinne's firm direction. "This is legally approved work on properly designated land," she stated loudly for the benefit of gathering neighbors. "The court has refused to issue an injunction. The HOA has approved the boundary adjustment. The township has issued permits." Every system that should have protected my property rights had been subverted. I retreated to my house, physically ill from the stress and sense of violation. That night, I sat in darkness watching through my window as spotlights illuminated workers continuing construction of what I now could see was a decorative water feature extending deep into what had been my yard. In the following days, my mental health deteriorated rapidly. I called in sick to work, unable to focus on anything besides the ongoing invasion of my property. Maxwell continued to pursue legal options, but warned that with Corinne's connections, we faced a prolonged and expensive battle with uncertain outcomes. "She is counting on you giving up," he advised during our phone consultation. "People like Corinne win because they exhaust their opponents financially and emotionally." His words resonated with painful truth. I was already thousands of dollars into legal fees with no resolution in sight. My once peaceful home had become a source of anxiety and helplessness. Each morning I woke to the sounds of construction, watching my property shrink as Corinne's expansion continued unabated. The system had failed me completely, and I had no idea how to fight back against someone who had so masterfully manipulated every available avenue of recourse. 2 weeks after the devastating HOA meeting, I had reached my lowest point. Legal options seemed exhausted, my savings were dwindling from attorney fees, and Corinne's project now included a fully installed water feature and small pergola on land that rightfully belonged to me. I had begun researching properties in other neighborhoods, considering the heartbreaking possibility of selling my home and starting over elsewhere. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself reviewing county records online, searching for anything that might help my case. I had been methodically examining property transfers in the neighborhood, hoping to find inconsistencies in how boundaries had been recorded over time. The work was tedious and often technical, requiring me to cross-reference multiple databases. Around 2 in the morning, I stumbled upon something unusual while checking the tax assessment records for Corinne's property. According to the county database, her property taxes were significantly delinquent, with no payments recorded since she had purchased the home. This seemed strange for someone so obsessed with property and appearances. Digging deeper, I discovered a notice of default filed against her property just 3 weeks earlier. My heart began racing as I clicked through to additional documents. Corinne's mortgage was in serious delinquency, with no payments made for over 6 months. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings, though no public auction had yet been scheduled. "This cannot be real," I whispered to my empty living room. The woman who had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal my land, who presented herself as wealthy and connected, was actually on the verge of losing her own home. The next morning, I called Maxwell's office the moment they opened. "I need to speak with him immediately," I told his assistant. "I have found something important." Maxwell listened carefully as I explained my discovery. "This is certainly interesting," he said cautiously, "but I am not sure how it helps your boundary dispute directly." "I am not thinking about the boundary anymore," I replied, an idea forming that seemed both audacious and perfect. "I want to know if I can legally purchase her house at the foreclosure auction." There was a long pause before Maxwell responded, and I could almost hear him smiling. "That would be completely legal, assuming you have the financial means. Foreclosure auctions are open to any qualified buyer." That afternoon, I met with Diane Carter, a financial advisor who specialized in real estate investments. I brought my complete financial records, including retirement accounts, savings, and a recent inheritance from my grandmother that I had been saving for home improvements. "It is technically possible," Diane confirmed after reviewing my finances. "You would need to liquidate several investments and possibly secure a bridge loan, but you could assemble enough for a competitive bid at auction." She looked up from her calculator. "Are you sure about this? Foreclosure purchases come with risks." "I have never been more certain of anything," I replied. "How do we proceed?" Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with both Diane and Maxwell to prepare for the auction. I liquidated my non-retirement investments, secured pre-approval for additional financing if needed, and learned everything I could about the foreclosure auction process. Maxwell personally checked the foreclosure filing to ensure everything was proceeding as recorded in the public notice. Meanwhile, Corinne's encroachment continued unabated. The water feature was completed, and landscapers were now installing elaborate lighting throughout what had been my garden space. We occasionally crossed paths, and each time she offered a smile that combined false sympathy with obvious triumph. She clearly believed she had won completely. "Just checking if you have reconsidered my offer," she said one evening as I returned from work. Days earlier, she had magnanimously offered to purchase my entire property at 15% below market value, presenting it as a generous solution to our unfortunate misunderstanding. "I am still considering my options," I replied neutrally, giving nothing away. "These things take time." "Do not take too long," she advised, gesturing toward the construction. "Property values are always changing, sometimes quite dramatically." If she only knew how dramatically her own property situation was about to change. According to Maxwell's research, the bank had scheduled the foreclosure auction for the following Tuesday. The public notice had been published in the legal sections of local newspapers and government websites, but most people never check those sources. Corinne appeared completely unaware that her home would be available to the highest bidder in less than a week. The weekend before the auction, I barely slept. My mind raced with both anxiety and anticipation. Diane had helped me determine a maximum bid based on my available funds and the estimated market value of Corinne's home. Maxwell had confirmed that all my paperwork was in order, including cashier's checks and required identification for the auction. Sunday evening, I stood at my kitchen window watching Corinne host what appeared to be a garden party in her backyard, partly on land that rightfully belonged to me. Guests admired the new water feature and pergola as servers circulated with champagne. Corinne held court in the center, gesturing expansively as she described her vision for further improvements. The contrast between her projected image and financial reality was staggering. In less than 48 hours, her house would be sold at public auction, and she had no idea. I had always considered myself a straightforward person who avoided conflict and treated others with respect. But watching Corinne celebrate on stolen property, I felt not guilt, but a sense of poetic justice about what was to come. She had manipulated the system to take what was mine. Now I would use the same system, legally and transparently, to acquire what would soon no longer be hers. Tuesday morning arrived with unseasonable fog that shrouded the neighborhood in gray mist. It seemed fitting for the dramatic shift about to occur. I dressed carefully in a conservative navy pantsuit that projected both professionalism and financial stability, important for being taken seriously at the auction. In my briefcase were cashier's checks totaling my maximum bid amount, identification documents, and proof of funds for the required deposit. The county courthouse steps were already crowded when I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled auction. Most attendees appeared to be professional investors or representatives from property management companies, regular participants in these proceedings. I recognized several local real estate agents speaking in hushed tones about the properties listed for today. I positioned myself toward the back of the gathering, not wanting to draw attention. Maxwell had warned me that auction regulars sometimes try to intimidate newcomers or form bidding alliances to keep prices artificially low. Following his advice, I maintained a neutral expression while carefully studying the other potential bidders. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the auctioneer appeared at the top of the courthouse steps and began reading the legal notices required before the bidding could commence. The process was far less dramatic than portrayed in movies: no gavel, no rapid-fire speaking. Instead, each property was announced clearly with its address, parcel number, and opening bid amount based on the outstanding mortgage balance plus fees. 3 properties were auctioned before Corinne's address was announced. Next property, 347 Oak Ridge Lane. Opening bid $425,000, representing the outstanding mortgage balance, interest, and administrative fees. Do I have an opening bid? My heart pounded as I raised my hand. 425,000, I stated clearly, loud enough to be heard but not so loud as to betray my emotional investment. A man in a charcoal suit countered immediately, 450. Another bidder joined, 475. The price climbed steadily as professional investors recognized the property's potential value. Oak Ridge was a desirable neighborhood, and despite my personal history with the house next door, I knew Corinne's colonial would likely sell for well above the opening bid under normal circumstances. 525,000, called a woman representing what appeared to be a property investment firm. I took a deep breath. 550,000, I countered, approaching my maximum predetermined limit. The bidding slowed as we crossed the $550,000 threshold. The charcoal suit man dropped out with a shake of his head. The investment firm representative hesitated, consulting briefly with a colleague via phone before declining to continue. 550,000 going once, the auctioneer announced, scanning the crowd. Going twice. The moment stretched eternally. Sold to the bidder in the back for $550,000. A curious mixture of elation and disbelief washed over me. I had done it. I now owned Corinne's house. At least I would once the paperwork was completed. The auctioneer's assistant approached with documents requiring immediate signature and payment of the deposit. My hands trembled slightly as I wrote the date beside my signature and handed over the certified check. "Congratulations," the assistant said professionally. "You will need to complete the remaining paperwork and full payment within 24 hours. The property transfer will be recorded by the county clerk within 3 business days, at which point you will receive the deed and keys." The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. I met with my bank to finalize the transfer of funds, signed countless legal documents at Maxwell's office, and provided all required identification for the property transfer. By Wednesday afternoon, everything was official. The county recorder had processed the deed transfer, and I was now the legal owner of 347 Oak Ridge Lane, Corinne's house. "When does she have to vacate?" I asked Maxwell as he handed me a set of keys to my new property. "Technically, she becomes a tenant without a lease as of the moment of property transfer," he explained. "You have the legal right to begin eviction proceedings immediately, but most new owners offer a short-term rental agreement or cash-for-keys arrangement to facilitate a smoother transition." I nodded thoughtfully. I am not interested in immediate eviction. In fact, I have something else in mind. That evening, I drafted a carefully worded letter on professional letterhead that Maxwell had helped prepare. To the current resident of 347 Oak Ridge Lane. This letter serves as official notification that ownership of the property at 347 Oak Ridge Lane has been transferred through legal foreclosure proceedings. As the new owner of record, I am writing to introduce myself and discuss your continued occupancy of the premises. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting regarding potential rental terms or alternative arrangements. Sincerely, my full legal name. Property owner. I sealed the envelope, deliberately excluding any return address that might reveal my identity prematurely. The following morning, I placed the letter in Corinne's mailbox, then returned home to wait. The confrontation that had been building for months was about to reach its climax, and I wanted to savor every moment of the revelation to come. The doorbell rang at precisely 7:30 p.m., less than 6 hours after I had delivered the letter. Through the peephole, I could see Corinne standing on my porch, her expression a mixture of confusion and indignation. She clutched my letter in one hand and her phone in the other. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and opened the door. "Good evening, Corinne," I greeted her with deliberate calmness. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, thrusting the letter toward me. "I received this ridiculous notice claiming my house has been sold. Obviously, there has been some mistake." "There is no mistake," I replied evenly. "Perhaps you should come in so we can discuss the situation privately." Corinne hesitated, clearly torn between her desire for confrontation and concern about neighborhood appearances. Ultimately, her need to resolve the situation won out, and she stepped into my living room with obvious reluctance. "My house cannot possibly have been sold," she insisted once the door closed behind her. "I own it outright." "Actually, Eastern National Bank owned it," I corrected her. "Until yesterday, when ownership transferred to me through a legally conducted foreclosure auction." The color drained from Corinne's face as realization began to dawn. "Foreclosure? That is absurd. There must be some administrative error." "No error," I assured her, retrieving a folder from my desk. "Your mortgage has been in default for over 6 months. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings according to the terms of your loan agreement. All legally required notices were published. The auction was conducted yesterday morning on the county courthouse steps, where I was the successful bidder." I handed her copies of the foreclosure notice, auction documentation, and newly recorded deed bearing my name. Corinne's hands trembled as she flipped through the papers, her composure cracking visibly with each page. "This cannot be happening," she whispered, more to herself than to me. Then, rallying, she straightened her spine and declared, "My attorney will contest this immediately. There has clearly been a failure of proper notification." "The notifications were sent to your legal address of record and published in the required public forums," I explained, maintaining my calm demeanor. But by all means, consult with your attorney. In the meantime, we need to discuss your current living situation. Corinne stared at me, the full impact of her position finally registering. You bought my house, she stated flatly. Out of all the potential buyers, you specifically purchased my property. Yes, I acknowledged simply. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. I gestured toward the window facing her property and the construction that had encroached on my land. I think you know why, Corinne. You manipulated the system to take something that belonged to me. Now I have legally acquired something that no longer belongs to you. For perhaps the first time since I had met her, Corinne appeared genuinely speechless. She sank onto my couch, the papers clutched in her manicured hands. What happens now? She finally asked, her voice uncharacteristically small. Now we negotiate, I replied, retrieving another document from my folder. I have prepared two options for you to consider. Corinne visibly steeled herself, hands clasped tightly in her lap. What options? Option 1, I explained. You vacate the property within 30 days. I will not pursue any damages for the illegal encroachment onto my land, and we part ways completely. Corinne opened her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could speak. Option 2, you sign this lease agreement I have prepared. The monthly rent is fair market value for the property. However, there are several special conditions you should review carefully. I handed her the lease document, watching as she scanned the pages with increasing disbelief. The special conditions included complete restoration of the original property boundaries at her expense, removal of all structures and landscaping that encroached on my land, and financial compensation for trees and plants destroyed during her project. This is extortion, Corinne hissed, her momentary vulnerability replaced by familiar anger. This is negotiation, I corrected her. You need housing. I own a house. These are the terms under which I am willing to rent to you. Alternatively, you can find somewhere else to live within 30 days. The choice is entirely yours. Corinne stood abruptly. I need to consult my attorney. Of course, I agreed. You have 48 hours to decide which option you prefer. After that, I will begin formal eviction proceedings. After Corinne left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had been less satisfying than I had imagined during those dark days when I felt powerless. Instead, I felt strangely hollow, as if justice served had not filled the void created by months of anxiety and violation. The following morning, I was awakened by the sound of trucks. From my window, I watched as workers began dismantling the water feature that had been installed on my property. Corinne stood supervising, her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing emphatically as the pergola was carefully disassembled rather than demolished. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang again. Corinne stood on my porch, looking thoroughly defeated but struggling to maintain her dignity. She held the lease agreement, now signed on the final page. I have chosen option 2, she stated flatly. The restoration work has already begun, as you can see. My attorney advised me that this is the most practical solution given the circumstances. I accepted the signed document. Thank you. I will have copies made for your records. Corinne hesitated before adding, I spoke with Administrator Phillips this morning. The original property survey has been discovered in the township archives and will be reinstated as the official record. Her emphasis on discovered made it clear she had pulled strings one final time, but now in the opposite direction. Within a week, my property boundaries were fully restored. The trees could not be replaced, of course, but Karen had arranged for mature saplings to be planted in the same locations. The HOA mysteriously became dormant once again after an emergency meeting in which Karen resigned as interim president. Most satisfying was the neighborhood response. As word spread about what had occurred, neighbors began stopping by to express their support. Mrs. Thompson brought her famous blueberry pie as a peace offering for not standing up during the HOA vote. Others apologized for their silence or shared their own stories of intimidation. "We should have helped you fight her," one neighbor admitted. "But everyone was afraid of her connections. What you did took real courage." 3 months later, Karen approached me as I worked in my restored garden. We had maintained a coldly professional landlord-tenant relationship, with rent paid promptly and no further conflicts. "I have found another place to live," she informed me. "I will be vacating at the end of the month." I nodded acknowledgement. "I will schedule a final walkthrough." She hesitated, then added, "I understand now what I put you through. It was wrong of me." The words seemed physically painful for her to pronounce. "Yes, it was," I agreed simply. After Karen moved out, I sold her house to a young family who had been looking to move into the neighborhood for years. I made a modest profit but took satisfaction in knowing they would be respectful neighbors who understood proper boundaries, both physical and social. As for me, I completed the garden expansion that had been interrupted by Karen's scheme. Where her water feature had briefly stood, I installed a small meditation bench beneath the new maple saplings. It serves as a reminder that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms, and that even the most carefully manipulated systems can ultimately bend toward fairness when confronted with patient determination. The neighborhood has returned to the peaceful community I originally purchased into, perhaps even stronger for having weathered Karen's brief reign of property terror. I sometimes sit on my meditation bench in the evenings, watching the sunset filter through growing maple leaves, and reflect on how close I came to giving up everything I had worked for. In the end, Karen taught me an invaluable lesson. Systems can be manipulated for ill, but they can also be navigated skillfully for justice. My property lines are now more secure than ever, recorded, verified, and respected by all. And somewhere across town, I like to think Karen examines property lines very carefully before making any landscaping decisions in her new rented home.